On this episode of Dr. White's Fun with Graphs, we are going to talk about spanning trees. So let G be a graph of vertices and edges. A subgraph is basically going to be a collection of a subset of the vertices and a subset of the edges. That also forms a graph in its own right. So for example, with this graph, if I just take the vertices A, B, C and the edge from A to B and B to C, I will get a subgraph. So you can get a subgraph by deleting vertices, like the vertex D and E, or deleting edges, like the edge from A to C. Now we say that a subgraph is induced if the subset of edges consists of all the edges in the original graph involving vertices in your subset. So for instance, this is not an induced subgraph because in the original graph, there's an edge from A to C that we are missing. If we add that edge back in, we have an induced subgraph. So basically, an induced subgraph is determined by its vertex set. You're just deleting vertices only. On the other hand, a spanning subgraph is one that has every vertex from the original graph. So that's one you can get by just deleting only edges. So this is not a spanning subgraph because we're missing D and E. But if we just add them back in and add in these edges, then we have a spanning subgraph. Likewise, if I just have the vertex by itself, this is also spanning. Now we say that a spanning subgraph is a spanning tree if it's also a tree. So we're looking for a subgraph that is a tree and contains every vertex of the original graph. These are important for certain applications. For instance, if you have a computer network or a highway network, a spanning tree would sort of be the minimal connected structure to guarantee that you can get from every point to every other point. And the theorem is that a graph G has a spanning tree if and only if the graph is connected. Rather than giving the proof, I'm just going to describe the algorithm for how you show it, or how you get the spanning tree. First, if your graph is not connected, then there exist two vertices such that there's no way to get from U to V. Then similarly, in any subgraph of G, you still can't get from U to V, so any subgraph, if G is disconnected, and H is a subgraph of G, is disconnected, then so is H. In particular, there's no way to get a spanning tree in that case because a tree has to be connected. So we're going to assume from now on that G is actually connected. And so here's our algorithm. We start with no edges. We pick some vertex in our graph, and we initialize W and X to both be the set containing just that vertex. As long as X is non-empty, we're going to take a vertex in X. We're going to explore any edge involving that vertex. If the other endpoint is not in W, then we're going to add that vertex to W and to X, and we're going to add that edge to F. So we think of W as the set of vertices we've discovered so far in this exploration of the graph. So we're starting from V and we're exploring the graph by going along edges. And X are sort of the boundary vertices in the exploration. So we add W, little w to our capital W into X, and we add the edge to F. Once we've gone over every edge involving U, we remove U from X because we've completely explored all the edges involving U. And then we continue. As long as there are vertices in X, we keep doing this process. And then at the very end, we have explored every vertex in the graph, so we return this vertex at F. Edge set F, I mean. So here is an example. here is a graph that's connected. Let's pick this vertex V. So our algorithm starts with X, capital X, and W being V. So we take this vertex V and we look at all edges incident to V. We see the other endpoints are not in W yet. So we add them to W and to X. And then we add those edges to F. So F is going to be colored in blue. And then we remove V from X. And so after one iteration of the loop, while loop, we end up with these three blue edges. Now if you take the vertex A and explore the two endpoints adjacent to A are both already in W, so then we just remove A from X. And then if we look at B, there's 4 edges incident to B. 3 of them involve vertices we've seen before, but there's a new one, which we're going to call D. So we add D to both X and W, and then we remove B from X. So after a few iterations of the loop, we're here. And because we explored from B to D, we added that edge. So basically the idea is that you're basically going through in what's called a breadth first search. And every time you encounter a new vertex, you color the edge you were on blue. All right, so now if I explore from C, I get 3 vertices I've seen before and 1 new one, E. So I color that edge blue, I add that vertex to both sets, and I remove C from X. And so this is where I'm at. And now you can see if I explore from D, I only encounter vertices I've seen before, and if I explore from E, I only encounter vertices I've seen before. And so after 2 more iterations, I terminate with the blue edges, which you see does form a spanning tree. The actual formal proof is to show that after each iteration of the while loop, the set WF is a spanning tree for the subgraph W, the induced subgraph of W. As you can see here, this is a spanning tree for these 4 vertices. This is a spanning tree for these 5 vertices. And if you prove that, then you've managed to prove the overall theorem. Now we're going to apply our results about spanning trees to the theorem we had before about bipartite graphs. The claim was that G is a bipartite graph if and only if G has no odd cycle. And first we're going to talk about a lemma, which is that if H is a subgraph of G and G is bipartite, then so is H. This isn't that complicated to prove. So you let V have a bipartition into A union B. And then the idea is that you intersect with the vertices of your subgraph, W, to get an A prime and a B prime. And then the claim is that this forms a bipartition for the subgraph. And how do you show this? We'll take any edge in the subgraph, UV. Since it's an edge from the subgraph, it's also an edge in the original graph. Since AB was a bipartition, it has to have one endpoint in A and another endpoint in B. But since it's also an edge in the subgraph, the 2 endpoints of the edge have to lie inside a W. So this is the only way you can draw the picture. Other ways of drawing the picture would be wrong. So the only way to draw an edge in W is like that, which means the edge goes from A prime to B prime. Thus, A prime, B prime is a bipartition of H. The corollary of this fact is that if H is not bipartite, then G is not bipartite. And it's a simple exercise to show that odd cycles are not bipartite. So if G has an odd cycle, it can't be, or contains an odd cycle, it cannot be bipartite. For those who are actually curious, one way to show this exercise would be by induction on the length of the odd cycle. All right, so now we can get back to our more general result. So if we have an odd cycle, then G is not bipartite. So what happens when you have no odd cycles? Well, then we need to be able to show that a bipartition must exist. And so how do we proceed? Well, one procedure is to find a bipartition for each component. So your graph is separated into connected components. For each connected component, just pick a spanning tree, which we know exists because each component is a connected graph. Now for each subcomponent, you pick a vertex and color it red. Now you alternate the colors on the paths in the tree. And you immediately see I made a typo there. There we go. And you see that you end up with a bipartition. That every edge has to be between two vertices of opposite colors. Inside the trees, this is immediately clear by the construction of this alternating path idea. So the question is, what about the black edges that aren't in the spanning tree? Why do we know for sure that they always end up between vertices of opposite colors? Well, the idea is that if that didn't happen, if you end up with two vertices of the same color connected by an edge, then you could trace back the paths in the tree back to that starting vertex. And it turns out you can show that at some point there's some common vertex along these two paths, and then if you go along the path to this common vertex, you're going to get an odd cycle. And that ends up being the proof. So I'm not doing all those details, I'm just explaining what ends up happening. So that's why we're guaranteed that this algorithm works. So it's a nice algorithm for creating a bipartition. So either you can find an odd cycle in a graph, or you can always find a spanning tree and then use it to create a bipartition.